Fundamentals of Mixing, lesson number 12, mix mapping. Mix mapping is a term that, I don't know if I can claim that I created it or was the first to say it. It was something that I kind of developed as my from my own experience of trying to analyze mixes. And then what I tried to do is I tried to quantify a lot of things that I was hearing and listening for into a formula. And much later on, as I started to teach, expanding beyond my professional analyzing mixes and understanding, what's kind of going on with things, I formulated it and called it mix mapping. So it's something that I put into the whole process at some later stage. The idea of mix mapping is creating a 3D sound field map of where things appear in a mix. Now, I have a whole series of this in the Mixing with Mike classes, episodes 1 through 48. I have 48 different songs. You can go there to the Mixing with Mike stuff, and you can kind of check it out. Now, generally, when you mix map, you're going to be doing it with a commercial release. And so what we would end up doing on a typical mix map is you would find a production that would be somewhat along the lines of what it was, very similar to what the production of this particular song or the particular song that you're mixing was based off of. So quite often when an artist writes a song or they compose a song, they have influences, certain artists that they like. Maybe there's certain stylisms or ways of approaching music, an attitude, an aggressiveness, slickness, whatever aspect of different artists that they really like, they bring in. And maybe when they write a song, they fashion it after a particular production. Like maybe there's one of the songs from one of those artists that most closely matches it. And as a result, during the production process, and ideally during the recording process and mixing process, that is used as like a template. So a guide mix or a reference mix is something that's commercially released that has a sonic signature that you may be going for with the song. When I do mastering work, I'll quite often ask for a reference master. Do you have a song, commercially released production, that you sort of modeled your production after and your mix after? Like, this is the signature that I want. And when I listen to it, the aspects I listen to for are how compressed it is, how limited it is, what's the general frequency response, how aggressive sounding is the compression, etc. In the mastering stage, you're not really necessarily dealing with the effects and things like that, but you're dealing with the separation, the 3D sound field, right? And the idea is that you're not trying to match, and this is really critically important, you're not trying to match the frequency response. Never cookie cutter a production. What you're trying to do is match the energy. And that's something that is a feeling sensation. It's not something that you can quantify necessarily with frequencies, because you can put on, like if you're into metal or whatever, and you could put on, I don't know, a Metallica track, and you could listen to, one of their older things and just be, like, oh man, this just like kills. I just love this. I can listen to it over and over again, and the vibe and the energy and the feeling of it. And then you can put on, like a Megadeth, or like, I don't know, pick an artist, a metal artist, and listen to that track, and the frequency response would be completely different, but you could be just as excited from that particular track as you were from the Metallica track. So however you go through that, you won't find that there is a particular formula that suits, although styles generally have certain patterns that they employ, certain general frequency response stamps, etc., balances of instruments, things along those lines. The idea of mix mapping is mapping out those basic ideas of how a production is put together. So it's sort of like the equivalent of transcribing a production from a mix perspective or a production perspective. And it's important to understand both of those things. Now, if you were, for example, a guitar player or a keyboard player or, whatever instrument, sax player, you listen and you will have artists that you like who are really good sax players. So maybe you're really into David Sanborn, let's just say, for example. So what will happen is if you're really into David Sanborn, you'll start to you'll get your chops up to a certain place, and then you'll start to play along with his music and try to play his solos and play his melodies and try to copy and emulate the way that he plays. And so you're actually transcribing, you're learning the notes that he plays. If you're a guitar player, I was really into Jeff Beck, and Jimmy Page, and guitar players like that. And so when I was picking up guitar and learning guitar, I would play those records and try to play along with them, and I would learn all the chord changes. I would transcribe them, and I would try to match and learn the solos and figure them out. And part of that is a way of learning how to use the instrument. So even though what you're doing is emulating or copying somebody else's work, what you get is like a way of doing things. You start to learn certain tricks, certain methods, the way that things are balanced. So if you're doing a mix map, there are lots of things that you'll be looking at, and this is what we're going to kind of get into. So there are two basic aspects to the mix mapping that we'll get into. So one of them is managing with the 3D sound field, and we'll take a look at that. And the other is, if I can scroll down here, something that's more like marking out instrument by instrument what it is that makes up the song. So in other words, on this particular track, without going through it, I know I have a bass, I have a kick, I have a snare, I have toms, so I can lay those out. Cymbals, right? So I'll just kind of put that in rather than overheads. I could put the hi-hat basically in there. There are guitar parts. So let's just say there's guitar 1, guitar 2, which are the guitars that are left, right. This will be pretty straightforward. I have a lead vocal, I have some background vocals. So I'll want to first list out what instrumentation I have. Now, there is no, in terms of the instrumentation, you don't want to get caught up like on, I hear a sax, and maybe you can't tell the difference between an alto sax or a tenor sax. That's fine, and you don't like maybe hear all the different differences between different flutes and things like that. So as you start to hear those things, it's a piccolo, put piccolo, or pan flute, put pan flute. It's a synth of some kind, a synth bass, right? An analog synth bass, write that. So what you're doing is you're kind of laying out as much as you can what you hear in terms of instrumentation. The next thing that you would kind of do is, if you think of this as like a left-right pan field, you could start to put out panning positions. So you'll know that like the pan position of bass, kick, and snare are here. How wide are the toms? So maybe if there are 3 toms that you hear, are they like wide left and right? In other words, is it hard left, center, hard right? Is that the way the toms are laid out, or are they done in some other a form? Same thing with the cymbals, right? Where you see like there's a splash cymbal here, a ride cymbal over to the right, another crash cymbal over here. The hi-hat, is way over to the right, or maybe a little bit more center, which is typical. Where are the guitars panned? They're panned hard left and hard right. Maybe I have, a third guitar part, whatever that other guitar part is, and it's kind of panned somewhere here. So understanding where those appear, and then also noticing how they match up in terms of the gain. So let's just like listen to some things, and let's just start with a basic thing. So this is actually a production or a mix that I did, which is cheating a little bit, but I want cheating a lot actually. But in terms of posting things on YouTube and not managing or dealing with rights issues and stuff like that, I'm not going to go out and necessarily pick out some commercially released material and get the channel shut down. So let's start with this, and let's just kind of focus on it. So what I want to do is I want to listen to this for a little bit, and what I want you to do is just kind of focus on the instrumentation that you hear and the pan position of the instrumentation. Okay, so I think we've basically heard enough. This is also simple, so it's not going to take forever. So all of the basic stuff, the main conventions happen. Like 99.8% of all mixes that you hear are going to have bass, kick, and snare in the center, vocal in the center, lead vocal in the center. It's just like it's kind of a standardized thing that most mixes do, particularly for radio release because of mono compatibility. Everything that's in the center when you go to mono increases in strength. So you want a lot of your more important elements of the song to push and drive through. It's also typical for things that are panned hard left and right, like the guitars. In this case, for the main guitars, there is another set of guitars which are in slightly, in the intro. They come back later. Are panned in a little bit, but those are actually pretty loud on the outside. Part of making them loud is that in mono summing, you're going to lose, half of that energy, but you don't want to lose the actual vibe of the guitar. So now the bass, the kick, and the snare and the vocal push a little bit more, but the guitars don't disappear. Sometimes people will pan their guitars in a little bit for that, just to kind of compensate for that. And then you have some background vocals, which are mostly, but not entirely, hard left and right. So when we listen to that, they're not split across the spectrum here. The toms are more or less, pretty close to center, not too wide. So even the cymbals, there's a ride cymbal that you could hear very clearly when he goes to the bell on that ride cymbal. To the right is a small splash cymbal that's up here. The hi-hat is out a little bit wider than that splash cymbal, but not very wide. It's drummer's perspective because you can hear, like, the cues are the toms, high to low going left to right, hi-hat being left versus right. Ride cymbals are almost always over the floor tom onto the right-hand side if you're in the drummer's perspective. So with those things, you can sort of get a sense of that. You'll find that in general, a lot of rock tracks are mixed in drummer's perspective, whereas if you go to like a jazz recording, it's usually done more towards an audience perspective. You have to think stylistically whether you have the sort of the air drum kind of effect, at play. And for that, I don't know, whatever it is, 0.2% of people who play drums who really notice those types of things. So you'll notice stuff like that. If you're a guitar player, you may recognize the particular, like they were using a Les Paul or whatever particular instrument they were using, etc. But what you're doing here is you're getting like a basic idea of it. The other thing that we're listening for is gain, and usually with a track like this, everything is kind of very upfront. Like the guitars are very loud. So if we were picking the loudest thing in the mix and we made that a 10, the guitars would almost be the loudest thing in the mix. And the kick probably and snare the next closest, if not a 10. And in this case, because of the artist, I would say the lead vocal is also right up there. If you listen to the track, and this is a perception, there's no exact number that you necessarily put on everything here, but if we listen to this, just listen to the balance, the perceived balance of the vocal and the guitars. All right, so I take that back. Coming back here, I would say the guitars are closer to a 9 and the vocals are a 10. And for the most part, things are going to be pushing towards the top. You could be more critical about how you scale it. The important thing here is not that there's a right number and a wrong number, because there's no way to mathematically check these things out. Your perception of it is more about understanding what those balances are, understanding what the ratio of kick to snare is, whether you call it a 7 and a 6 or whatever numbers that you put on it. Like, quite often in tracks like this, the toms are really loud, but in this, they're not very loud. They're not like a huge part, so they're closer to a 5. The cymbals are lower. In this case, in this particular case, because they were very harsh sounding, so there was a tendency for me, just knowing the mix, to kind of tuck them a little bit. So they're relatively lower in level, but they're still felt. And you could kind of go through the parts and notice what each of them is. The background vocals are there, but they're not overtaking the lead. They're just supporting it. Sometimes the background vocal part will become very apparent. You see this a lot in R&B music when you get to the hook section, where the background part is actually the hook and the lead vocal is ad-libbing over the top of it. Okay, the idea here is that you notice what's going on with this. So other things that we'll notice and we'll listen for are certain patterns of compression, equalization, and effects. So on certain things like with this, the drums overall, if we kind of did like an overall effect on the drums right here, is that there is actually a big kind of room vibe, right? You get like a big rock room kind of thing going on. And then there's also, it's pretty heavy compressed, and it's like a pumping and breathing kind of compression. So the pumping and breathing, like 1176 style compression, where you have it you have a lot of that breathing kind of movement in the drums that helps to create the size of it. There's a plate on the snare. When we listen to it, overall, the drums are very compressed, but what we have on this is a lot of like parallel compression type of stuff, like heavy compression, distortion parallels that are kind of running in there. So the compression, and it's not necessary that you go through and say, okay, that what particular compressor, maybe you hear something and you say, oh, that sounds like a DBX compressor, which is not what was used. But it may have a certain sound. In this case, it's all VCA compression, right? So the VCA compression, like SSL style VCA compression, is a lot of what drives the individual elements of the track. And it has a very SSL kind of edge, like E-series kind of edge, a little warmer, but got a gritty mid-range. And that SSL compression has like a very aggressive forward-leaning kind of compression. Like it really, with a slow attack setting, really drives things forward. Now, what I hear with this, we'll kind of get to where the compression and some of these things kind of work in, but you can also start to get into equalization curves. So one way to approach this is, rather than saying EQ yes or no, you could think of this as like a 20-20 curve, where you say maybe the bass has like, there's not a lot of high-end energy, it kind of rolls off, but it's pretty balanced, otherwise here, or it's very low-endy. Where the kick drum, has a distinctive bump, and then, like another, like attack there, like maybe like a 1K-ish attack or a 2K-ish attack. You might notice that. Is the snare got, some body on the low end, or is it mostly high frequency, right? So again, you're noticing that. Notice how the tilt or balance of the frequency is. And even if you kind of work from that perspective, you might get a thing like lots of low end, lots of top end, and sculpted out mid-range. Or maybe when you got to the guitars, you realize it's like, okay, there's a lot of mid-range energy and it's more warm on the top, or it's very edgy on the top. And even if you're just focusing on those particular tonal aspects, or you say, like, it sounds like there's a lot of, 500 or 800 mid-ranginess to this, write that in. Again, it's not necessarily like a right or wrong answer here, because, you're not going to go through and do a frequency analysis unless, even if you kind of went through the individual tracks and did it this way, with the multi, looking at the original mix, all the frequencies that are used in the equalization are relative to what the original recording was, which means you may see a crap load of top end added in on the EQ, and it may be because the original voice was extremely dull. Whereas if the original recording of the voice is extremely bright, you say, wow, they didn't add like a whole lot of top end on this, but it still seems very bright. All you care about is the end result, because whatever your source material is, if that's the target that you're going after, then you want to understand what that target is, how it leans. Like maybe with the lead vocal, there's like a really solid warmth in the mid-range that makes it focus really well, but there's this really crispy edge that I'm trying to get. And so however you want to describe it and lay it out, you want to work with those types of things. So even if you go through and you say the vocal sounds very compressed, it sounds like it's pumping and breathing a lot, anything that you can kind of hear in that realm, you don't have to, in other words, don't kill yourself. the way that this will work, especially when you get into effects and stuff like that, is you start to hear things, notice, like particularly on a vocal, do you hear a delay? Do you hear a slap, a doubler effect, or chorusing effect on the vocal? Does it sound like there's a oral exciter, right? Like a hyped frequency, compression type of stuff that you would get from a multi-band oral exciter, or even like an Aphex oral exciter or something like that. So any of those things that you hear, whether you even understand it, that you're not, even if the word you write in is just crispy, it sounds crispy, do whatever you can, like, to describe it. Mid-rangey. It sounds like, there's a lot of energy in the, 400 to 800 range on this guitar. So fine. Whatever it is that you hear, what happens is that your brain starts to map out what's going on in the song. You start to be able to create things. So if you work, and the best way to do this is if you work with a particular style of music, like just to say you're doing, deep house music, or you're doing electronic dance music, whatever it is, a particular style of it, right? Electronica or whatever. And when you start analyzing those mixes, start to pick apart what those different aspects are. It's very important that you write it down, because when you write it down, it actually, the more senses that you use in any process of learning, the more that it maps into your brain what's going on. And you'll start to see patterns of balances between kick and snare, between what types of effects are used. You notice that kick drums are always dry, snare drums are always wet, et cetera, et cetera. Like, notice these types of things. Are there certain delay timings that you hear, like with a vocal, like when there are delays, that they always seem to be eighth note or quarter note? And maybe you don't know what they are, but when you stumble across them on the plugin, you start to take a note. Oh yeah, when you use like a dotted eighth and an eighth note left and right, and they ping pong off each other, you get these really cool other rhythmic values when they start to cross feed to each other. Things like that. And that starts to teach you about how to better put together your productions. So I used to do a lot of this work. I was constantly listening to music, and especially listening to it in studio. And that's exactly where you need to listen to it. It's one thing to listen to stuff on your earbuds, or as you're going around listening in your car. It's a much more important thing to actually listen in the space that you mix in, and really listen to stuff every day, and listen to things all the time. Have some music on, even if it's at a low level, because it will give you an idea as you're mixing, like how bright things are, how dull things. Like when you hear something that's really cool, really notice the way that it images in the speakers, how it lays out, and kind of take into account these things. After a short period of time, if you start writing things like this down, and this is just like a simple spreadsheet type of thing, you could do it on an Excel app or whatever, that type of thing. It's not a difficult thing to do. Just grab a piece of paper, do it, or a sketch pad or something like that, and lay that out. That's part number one. The other is, and this is also an important thing here, which is laying out the 3D sound field. And what this is this is a very different exercise. This is about talking about where the drums appear in the 3D sound field. So in other words, if I am listening to this mix, I may notice that, for example here, and I could use different colors if I want, that the bass has a certain place in the mix, that it kind of sits like right here. And the kick drum pushes through it. Maybe the kick drum is a little bit forward from that. So maybe I'll pick a different color for this. And my kick drum and my snare energy are up here. Maybe the snare energy is more up front than the kick drum. And I can put a size on it, like the size I make the box is basically the size of the instrument. So if I'm dealing with guitars, I can not only say like, wow, these guitars sound very up front, but how much of that frontness do they occupy? Do they occupy a wider area, or are they smaller and more narrow? When I get to the vocal, where does the vocal appear? If the vocal appears, out in front of that other instrumentation, how far away is it, or how up front? So most of this stuff is pushing definitely towards the front. The other thing that you can look at is what happens on the backside. In other words, what happens with the reverberant energy. So for example, with the drums, I may say the drums themselves, actually the reverberant energy kind of exists mostly in a space that sounds pre-delayed. Like, so I have this size with the drums, but a lot of it appears behind. Like what kind of size do I have with the vocal and the content of the vocal and the vocal reverb. If I hear delays, what are they? Are they ping-ponging delays that are left and right? Do they sound like they're off in the distance? Are they mono and behind? If there's a chorus or a spread effect, how wide does that spread effect go? Does it go outside the speakers? Or is it just kind of like a subtle smoothing and it sounds very centered? And so when you do this, you can also see like how big is the reverb, and you start to notice after a while, like you hear the differences between spring reverbs and plates and halls and stuff like that. Because when you hear a certain effect and you're really studying, it's like, I really like that reverb. It kind of sounds like a hall, or maybe it's a plate with some delays fed into it. And then you start experimenting with stuff, and then you stumble across things, you come up with new stuff that you didn't expect. And when you stumble across that sound, it may be because you call up the same plugin that was used in that particular mix. And so you call it up, you listen to it, it's like, wow, okay, that's what that sound is. And when I get that pre-delay, I get that separation, and now I hear that depth perception and that aspect of it. Now, there is this, which is the top field where you get that depth perception. And this plays very, very much into how when you're listening to the mix and all the setup of the earlier lessons here. So if you have not seen the earlier lessons where I talk about speaker setup and 3D imaging and 3D mapping, you have to do that, and you have to set up your speakers appropriately in order for that to kind of make sense. On this end, what you're listening for is the height information. So what you'll hear is that, the bass energy is sinking lower, not too low, but lower, as is the kick energy, which kind of drops a little bit, down below that. The snare energy is more centered right here, actually it's down a little bit from there. Where does the vocal? The vocal actually sounds like it's rising above, like the vocal, let's see if I can do this and select it. It sounds bigger from the front view and over the top of everything, right? So it's raised up a bit behind, whereas those backgrounds that are in between are kind of lower in the speaker and more towards this side of things. And the guitars, from this perspective up in the front are kind of, carrying this under, they go a little bit lower. And so as you start to put some of this stuff together and fit it together, you'll start to notice that there is some up-down imaging. Like it's very often the case where a vocal is either in between the speaker if it's more mid-rangey, or if it has a lot of air and edge, it'll have a tendency to rise and raise up above the speakers. And that's a really cool thing, because now that snare drum doesn't get covered up with the vocal. Or if you have an acoustic guitar here and you can get it to sit a little bit lower between the speakers, the separation of the two starts to happen. And a lot of that type of stuff those types of things and how you move things around will be covered in the course. So if you watch some of those videos where I talk about 3D mix mapping and stuff like that, I talk about how compression settings set the front back depth, how frequency settings raise or lower things in the speaker, how the different frequency areas, high right up on the top to low on the low end, how they interfere with each other or balance each other and affect each other. So the simple things of the left-right stuff is just a pan pot. If you had a keyboard, it might be that keyboard, is a Hammond organ and it sounds very wide and it's right across the spectrum here. Or maybe it's a string part that like goes way up above the top, like a halo over the top of the mix. Whatever it is, you want to map these things out and notice when these different parts come in, how they lay out. And all of this can be a tosser. It could just be a big mess, where maybe somebody in your family walks in, looks at it, and thinks like you've gone crazy because you're sitting there with a box of crayons, like coloring a page, and it looks like a 2-year-old. And if it does, then that's really cool because you're getting something. And so part of drawing it out and putting these things out ends up being really important because it ends up helping you to really understand what is going on when you're listening to a mix. So now with all those things in mind, let's go back and let's listen to the mix one more time. Now, one thing I didn't do is that there's like a reverse thing. Sometimes the reverse thing, like it has a phase effect on it, right? And that phase just sort of sweeps in with the envelope of the reverse guitar. But it's not, and it's got a stereo width type of effect, but it's not panning or moving around. So these are other things that you might notice, but let's just listen to this. So you hear there's a different voice that's in there, and if you listen to the whole song, there's also a bridge section here.
It's like an assassin in the heat of the moment.
Notice the
Got
level
my
changes, the
hand on the
filtering on the voice.
trigger. I'm ready to pull. Watching your every move.
You like the flange on the build there, that this sweeping effect on the guitar that's in the background with the voice there. These are things that, like just from a production perspective and a mix perspective, that you would go through and notice. So, again, the point here not being that you get everything like correct or exact, or, oh no, the snare is up, 2 more inches than what Mike put it there. Like, all of that doesn't matter as long as you get like like you get an idea, you start to map out what's going on. That becomes the important thing. And then the more you do that, it's like your hearing is very much like it's very much like a muscle. The more that you work it, the more that the more responsive it actually becomes to doing something. So, for example, let's just take an example, just like riding a bike. You start riding a bike, and it's like you're barely able to stay on it and kind of keep it upright. So then you learn to do that, but you're kind of wobbling a little bit. But then after a while, you just hop on your bike, you just jump on it, and you go, right? And then all of a sudden, you're doing tricks, you're doing wheelies, and you're jumping over things, and you're doing stuff like that, and you're sliding, down rails of stairways. And you start doing tricks, and you start to get better and better and more proficient at it, and you start to become your body becomes more responsive to the environment and things that are going on. And the same thing happens with the mix. Like, the more that you do it, the more that you study it from this perspective, and the more that you do it and you try things and you do things, the more sensitive you become to the detail and the difference and the variation. So if you do a mix map now, you hold on to it, you do one, you keep doing it every week, and then you, like 6 months later, you look back at your original one, you're like, oh my God, this is like caveman stuff, and you look at the new stuff, and it's like you're sitting there was like, oh yeah, pre-delayed plate, and eighth note delay times, and all of this sort of stuff, and you're starting to get your ears tuned in a whole lot more. So this is really this is an important thing to really understand. And if you can grasp this concept, then you could start to build out a mix or a production of your own. So when you get something and you get a good reference song to the track that you're working on, listen to that reference, do a mix map on it, spend a half hour, 45 minutes, or an hour, because that will save you a lot of time, because now you can start to create an imprint or an idea for what the new mix will be, and that'll be part of the next lesson. So that's it for lesson number 12, mix mapping. And I think this is a very, very important thing to improving your skills. And it's also something that you can do if you're not, with headphones. So you can do this. So if you happen to be away from your studio and you got some time to do some creative listening, you got a pad and paper, or even like a little sketch pad with your, with your iPad or something where you can write and draw things, go for it. Write down whatever it is that you hear. That's important, right? Because it helps you to map out in your brain, make those connections, and remember what it is that you're actually hearing. Okay, fundamentals of mixing, lesson 12, mix mapping.